January 17, 1942, Bataan Peninsula, Philippines. The jungle air hung thick and wet, clinging to skin like a second uniform. In the pre-dawn darkness, a young Wehrmacht liaison officer named Klaus Becker crouched beside his Japanese counterparts in a forward observation post, watching the American defensive line through field glasses. He had been sent from Berlin 6 weeks earlier to study Japanese tactics, to learn from their swift conquests across the Pacific. The Reich wanted to understand how an Asian power had humbled the white colonial forces so thoroughly. But on this morning, as the first assault wave prepared to move against the American positions, Becker noticed something that made him pause. Through the humid air came a sound he had never heard before, peculiar, metallic rhythm, sharp and unnervingly fast. Ping, crack dash crack dash crack dash crack dash crack dash crack dash was the sound of democracy reloading. At twice the speed of tyranny. The M1 Garand rifle, adopted by the United States Army in 1936, represented more than an evolution in small arms design. It was the physical manifestation of American industrial philosophy, a marriage of mass production, capability, and democratic principles that would echo across every battlefield of the Second World War, while the armies of Germany and Japan still equipped their soldiers with bolt-action rifles whose fundamental design stretched back to the 1890s. The United States became the only major combatant to field a semi-automatic rifle as its standard infantry weapon. The difference was not merely technical. It was ideological. It spoke to how a nation valued the life of its common soldier, how it harnessed its industrial might, and ultimately, how it conceived of warfare itself. To understand the revolutionary nature of the Garand's en-bloc clip system, one must first understand the world of rifle design that preceded it. For nearly half a century, military rifles had operated on a principle of manual cycling. A soldier fired, then manually operated a bolt to eject the spent cartridge and chamber a new round. The German Karabiner 98K, the standard rifle of the Wehrmacht, required 5 distinct motions for each shot. Unlock the bolt, pull it back, push it forward, lock it down, and squeeze the trigger. A well-trained German soldier could fire perhaps 15 aimed shots per minute. The Japanese Arisaka Type 99 operated on similar principles, perhaps slightly faster in practiced hands, but still fundamentally limited by human physiology and mechanical design. These were weapons of the old world, refined to near perfection within their paradigm. But trapped by that very paradigm, the M1 Garand eliminated the manual cycle entirely. Gas pressure from the fired round drove a piston that automatically ejected the spent casing and chambered a fresh cartridge. The soldier simply aimed and pulled the trigger 8 times in rapid succession. Then came the distinctive ping, the sound of the empty en-bloc clip ejecting upward from the receiver. In skilled hands, a new clip could be inserted in under 2 seconds. The cyclic rate of aimed fire doubled, sometimes tripled. But more significantly, the soldier's concentration remained on the target, not on operating a bolt mechanism. His eyes stayed downrange. His body position remained stable. The Garand turned the American infantryman into something his enemies had not anticipated, a mobile, a sustained source of accurate firepower, the genius and the controversy in that 8-round en-bloc clip. Traditional bolt-action rifles used stripper clips or chargers, simple metal strips that held 5 rounds and were discarded after loading the rifle's internal magazine. The en-bloc clip was different. It was inserted into the rifle as a complete unit, becoming part of the feeding mechanism itself. When the last round was fired, the clip ejected automatically, leaving the action open and ready for immediate reloading. Critics within the US military establishment had argued against this design for years. They worried about ammunition waste. What if a soldier needed to reload before firing all 8 rounds? They fretted about that distinctive ejection ping, revealing positions to the enemy. They preferred systems that used detachable box magazines, like those found on the Browning automatic rifle. But John Garand, the rifle's designer, understood something his critics did not. In the chaos of combat, simplicity trumped flexibility. A soldier, under fire, did not carefully count his remaining rounds. He fired until empty, heard the ping, and reloaded reflexively. The system eliminated thought, and in eliminating thought, it eliminated hesitation. Klaus Becker would write about what he witnessed that January morning in a letter that would never reach Berlin, intercepted instead by American intelligence after the fall of Bataan. "The Americans do not fire as we do," he wrote in careful script. "Our men advance, they take cover, they aim with precision, they fire, they work the bolt, they fire again. This is how infantry has fought since Sedan, since the Franco-Prussian War. But the Americans, they fire in a continuous stream. One sees the muzzle flash, then another, with no pause for mechanical action. At first, our Japanese colleagues believed they faced automatic rifles, perhaps the Browning guns we had been briefed about, but the volume of fire was too widespread. Every American rifleman was shooting like this. In 3 minutes of engagement, I estimate each American position fired 40 to 60 rounds. Our doctrine suggests this rate of fire should empty their ammunition pouches within an hour of sustained combat. Yet they continued throughout the morning. Where does this ammunition come from? How can they sustain such expenditure? The answer to Becker's question lay not in the Philippines, but in Lake City, Missouri, in Evansville, Indiana, in Winchester, Massachusetts. It lay in the vast industrial capacity of the United States, in factories that could produce not millions, but billions of rounds of ammunition. The en-bloc clip system demanded enormous logistical support. Each soldier carried 10 clips in his standard ammunition belted rounds. Additional clips filled his musette bag, his pockets, his pack. Unlike German or Japanese soldiers, who might carry 60 to 90 rounds into battle, the standard American infantry load approached 200 rounds, and behind them stretched a supply chain unlike anything the world had seen. Trucks carrying wooden crates, carrying cardboard boxes, carrying hundreds of en-bloc clips, each clip holding 8 cartridges of precisely manufactured .3 UO6 Springfield ammunition. The Garand did not merely let American soldiers fire faster. It demanded they fire faster, and it demanded an entire industrial nation be organized to support that faster firing. By the summer of 1942, when Klaus Becker had long since been captured and the Philippines had fallen, the Garand's reputation had spread through both the Japanese and German military intelligence communities. Reports filtered back from Guadalcanal, from North Africa, from every point where American forces engaged Axis troops. The pattern was consistent. American infantry could deliver sustained fire at rates that seemed impossible. German tactical doctrine, refined over years of Polish and Russian campaigns, assumed that an infantry squad's main firepower came from its machine guns. The MG-34 or MG-4 while riflemen provided supporting fire and assault capability. The American squad seemed to have no such distinction. Every man was a machine gun, or so it seemed to soldiers on the receiving end. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal began reporting a phenomenon they called the American drum fire, a continuous rolling sound of rifle fire that recalled the artillery barrages of the Great War. Private First Class Yoshida Takeshi, whose diary was recovered after the Battle of the Tenaru River, wrote with a mixture of fascination and dread about the experience. "We were told the Americans were soft, that they could not endure jungle warfare, that their spirit was weak. Perhaps their spirit is weak. I cannot know their hearts, but their rifles are not weak. When we charged their positions at the river, expecting to overwhelm them with our fighting spirit. They did not waver. They did not rise to meet us with bayonets, as honorable warriors should. They sat in their foxholes and fired, and fired, and fired. The sound was like rain on a tin roof, endless and mechanical. Men fell as if cut by an invisible scythe. I saw Corporal Sato struck by 3 bullets in the time it takes to draw a breath. How is this possible? Do the Americans not need to reload? Are their rifles enchanted by some Western magic? There was no magic, only the en-bloc clip and the industrial philosophy it represented. But 2 soldiers, conditioned by different military traditions, the effect seemed almost supernatural. The German and Japanese armies had been built on principles of individual marksmanship, fire discipline, and ammunition conservation. A German soldier was taught to make each shot count, to fire only when he had a clear target, to preserve ammunition for the decisive moment. This was partly tactical wisdom and partly logistical necessity. The Wehrmacht's supply lines, stretched across conquered Europe and deep into Russia, could not sustain profligate ammunition expenditure. Similarly, Japanese logistics, dependent on vulnerable shipping lanes and limited industrial capacity, demanded strict ammunition discipline. Their soldiers were taught that ammunition was precious, that 10 well-aimed shots were worth more than 50 hasty ones. The Americans, by contrast, had developed a doctrine built on fire superiority. American tactical manuals from the 1940s read differently than their German counterparts. Where German doctrine emphasized maneuver and decisive assault, American doctrine emphasized establishing fire superiority, then maneuvering under that umbrella of covering fire. The M1 Garand was the perfect weapon for this philosophy. An American infantry squad, with 8 Garands and 1 Browning automatic rifle, could lay down a base of fire that pinned enemy forces while other elements maneuvered. The Garand's semi-automatic capability meant that this base of fire could be sustained by the entire squad, not just the bar gunner. Every rifleman was a suppression asset. Every soldier contributed to the wall of fire that American tactics demanded. The contrast became most apparent in the close quarters fighting that characterized the Pacific Theater. In the jungles of Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and later in the Philippines' liberation, ranges were often measured in tens of meters, not hundreds. Visibility was limited. Ambushes were sudden and brutal. The advantage belonged to whoever could put the most rounds down range in the first 30 seconds of contact. Time and again, American after-action reports from Pacific battles noted the same pattern. Japanese forces would initiate contact with small arms fire and grenade attacks. American forces would respond with a volume of rifle fire that surprised and often overwhelmed the attackers. The Garand's rate of fire, combined with the American practice of firing en masse rather than seeking individual targets, created a form of close-range suppression that the Japanese had not anticipated. Sergeant John Basilan, who would receive the Medal of Honor for his actions on Guadalcanal, later described the experience in a rare interview before his death at Iwo Jima. The Japs would come at us in the dark, screaming and hollering, trying to scare us, trying to make us panic. And yeah, it was scary as hell. But we had our Garands, and we knew what to do. You didn't think about aiming at individual men. You fired into the mass. You worked the trigger as fast as you could pull it, and you kept firing until you heard that ping. Then you reloaded and fired again. The sound of 30 or 40 Garands going off at once was louder than the Japs screaming. It was louder than anything, and it worked. They couldn't get through that fire. They couldn't even get close. Yet the in-block clip system had its skeptics even among American forces. The most common complaint was the inability to top off the rifle with individual rounds. If a soldier had fired 3 rounds and wanted to reload, he had to either waste the remaining 5 rounds by firing them, or manually eject the partially full clipper cumbersome. process that required pulling back the operating rod and thumbing the clip latch. In a lull in combat, this was manageable. Under fire, it was nearly impossible. The en-bloc system was designed for a specific combat rhythm: fire 8 rounds, reload, fire 8 more. It did not accommodate partial reloads. And this inflexibility troubled soldiers accustomed to more traditional magazine-fed weapons. The famous Garand ping, the sound of the empty clip ejecting, generated particular controversy. In training, instructors warned that this distinctive noise could alert enemy soldiers that an American rifle was empty, creating a window for attack. Stories circulated of clever German or Japanese soldiers who listened for the ping and then rushed the no empty American position. These stories have largely been debunked by historians. In the chaos of actual combat, with explosions, shouting, and the general cacophony of battle, the small metallic ping of an ejecting clip was virtually inaudible beyond a few meters. Moreover, the reload time for a practiced soldier was under 2 seconds, hardly enough time for an enemy to identify the sound, decide to attack, and close the distance. Nevertheless, the myth persisted, and some soldiers took to carrying an empty clip to throw, creating a false ping to lure enemy soldiers into exposing themselves. The true revolution of the Garand lay not in any single engagement or tactical advantage, but in its cumulative psychological effect on both American soldiers and their enemies. For Americans, the Garand became a symbol of their nation's industrial superiority and democratic values. Unlike the aristocratic bolt-action rifles of Europe, which rewarded individual marksmanship and years of training, the Garand was democratic in its effectiveness. It made the average soldier more lethal, closing the gap between the expert marksman and the hastily trained replacement. In the American military philosophy, which valued the life of each soldier as a citizen temporarily in uniform rather than as a professional warrior, this was crucial. The Garand reduced the skill floor required for effective infantry combat, allowing the mass citizen army that democracy produced to compete with the professional armies of totalitarian states. For Axis soldiers, the encounter with the Garand, or more precisely, with the volume of fire it enabled, represented a gradual disillusionment with their own military superiority. German soldiers, particularly those transferred from the Eastern Front to face Americans in Italy or France, noted the difference immediately. Soviet forces, while numerous and increasingly well equipped, still relied primarily on bolt-action Mosin-Nagant rifles, with firepower concentrated in submachine guns and machine guns. The Americans distributed firepower across the entire squad. Every foxhole was a source of rapid, sustained fire. German tactical reports from Normandy, from the Hurtgen Forest, from the Battle of the Bulge, repeatedly noted that American infantry squads delivered more small arms fire than equivalent German units. Despite the German advantage in machine gun design, this firepower disparity had strategic implications that cascaded beyond individual firefights. German commanders in the West found that American positions were harder to suppress with preparatory fire than Soviet or British positions. The semi-automatic rifles allowed Americans to keep up effective fire even while under artillery bombardment or machine gun fire, where Soviet infantry might hunker down under a German barrage, waiting for it to lift before returning fire. American GIs would continue shooting from their foxholes, maintaining pressure on German assault formations. This made frontal attacks against American positions costly and forced German commanders to seek flanking maneuvers that required time and coordination. That became increasingly rare as Allied air superiority limited German movement during daylight hours. The en-bloc clip, that small metal rectangle holding 8 rounds, became an object of almost totemic significance. American soldiers developed superstitions around it. Some believed that the 5th round in each clip was lucky, since it sat at the middle of the clip. Others insisted on loading their clips with alternating ball and tracer rounds, though this was against regulations. Still others claimed they could feel by weight alone how many rounds remained in their Garand, though tests consistently disproved this. These superstitions mattered less than the confidence the system instilled. Soldiers trusted their Garands in a way they trusted few other pieces of equipment. The rifle was heavy 9.5 pounds compared to the 8-pound Mauser butt that weight provided. Stability for aimed fire. The rifle was long, awkward in close quarters, but its length provided superior accuracy at distance. And always there was that 8-round capacity, that ability to fire and fire and fire without pausing to work a bolt. By 1944, as the tide of war had turned decisively against the Axis powers, captured German and Japanese documents revealed the extent to which the Garand had influenced enemy thinking. A German intelligence assessment from January 1944, circulated among Wehrmacht commanders preparing to face the anticipated invasion of France, devoted 3 full pages to the M1 rifle and appropriate counter-tactics. The document acknowledged that German infantry squads could not match the sustained fire rate of equivalent American units and recommended that German forces rely more heavily on machine guns and mortar to compensate. It also suggested that German soldiers conserve their rifle ammunition for decisive moments rather than engaging in sustained firefights with an implicit admission that trying to outshoot American infantry was futile. Japanese tactical documents from the same period showed similar evolution in thinking. By 1944, Japanese commanders had largely abandoned the bonsai charge tactics that had been costly failures on Guadalcanal and in New Guinea. Instead, they developed defensive tactics centered on allowing American forces to advance into carefully prepared killing zones, then engaging them with crossfires and ambushes designed to negate the American firepower advantage. On islands like Peleliu and Iwo Jima, Japanese forces dug deep fortifications and forced Americans to fight for every yard of coral and volcanic rock. These tactics were partly a response to American material superiority in general, but specifically acknowledged that meeting American infantry in open combat, where the Garand's rate of fire could be brought to bear, was suicidal. The industrial story behind the Garand's dominance is as significant as its tactical one. By the end of 1945, American factories had produced over 4 million M1 rifles. Springfield Armory and Winchester Repeating Arms Company were the primary manufacturers, but the production network extended across dozens of subcontractors producing components. The en-bloc clips themselves were manufactured by the hundreds of millions. Literally billions of rounds were produced in 8-round clips, each clip stamped from sheet metal, each one quality tested to ensure it would feed smoothly and eject reliably. This was mass production on a scale that Axis powers could not match. Even if they had wanted to adopt semi-automatic rifles, Germany did experiment with semi-automatic designs. The Guha 41 and later the Guha 43 entered limited production, but never achieved the reliability or production numbers to replace the bolt-action Carabiner 9.8K as the standard infantry weapon. Part of this was due to German industrial limitations. By 1942, German factories were struggling to maintain production of existing weapons, while also developing new designs for jets, rockets, and other wonder weapons that Hitler believed would turn the tide of war. But part of it was philosophical. The German military establishment never fully embraced the American concept of distributed firepower. They continued to believe in concentrated firepower from specialist weapons machine guns, assault rifles for elite troops, supported by bolt-action rifles for ordinary infantry. This was not entirely unreasonable given German logistical constraints, but it meant that the average German infantryman remained armed with a rifle design from 1898, fighting against Americans with a rifle design from 1936. The Japanese situation was even more stark. Japanese industrial capacity, never matching that of the United States even before the war, collapsed under sustained American bombing and naval blockade. By 1945, Japanese factories struggled to produce enough rifles of any kind, let alone develop new semi-automatic designs. Japanese soldiers at war's end were often equipped with a hodgepodge of weapons Type 99 rifles if they were lucky. Older Type 38s, captured weapons, even bamboo spears in the final desperate months. The technological gap between the armies had widened to an almost comical degree, though there was nothing funny about it for the soldiers on either side. Yet, for all its advantages, the Garand was not without genuine limitations. The en-bloc clip, while allowing rapid sustained fire, held only 8 rounds fewer than the 10-round box magazines being developed for future military rifles, and significantly fewer than the 20 and 30-round magazines that would become standard in the post-war era. The clip had to be inserted with the bolt locked back, which required a specific manual of arms and could not be done one-handed. The rifle's gas system, while reliable, required regular cleaning to prevent carbon buildup from affecting operation, a particular challenge in the sandy conditions of North Africa or the humid, muddy jungles of the Pacific. And despite its semi-automatic operation, the Garand was still fundamentally a precision rifle, effective at ranges up to 500 yards, but increasingly ineffective at the close ranges that characterized urban combat or jungle warfare. These limitations would inform the next generation of military rifle design. The lessons learned from the Garand: the value of semi-automatic operation, the importance of reliable feeding systems, the need for distributed firepower would culminate in the development of select-fire assault rifles like the M14 and eventually the M16. But in the context of World War II, the Garand's limitations mattered less than its advantages. It was significantly better than anything else fielded in comparable numbers, and that was enough. The human stories that accumulated around the Garand are countless. There was Private First Class Harold Schultz, who, on Iwo Jima, fought his way up the slopes of Mount Suribachi with his Garand, firing an estimated 300 rounds in 6 hours of sustained combat, reloading so often that the metal of his rifle became too hot to touch without gloves. There was Lieutenant Ardy Murphy, who would become the most decorated American soldier of the war, and who later said that his Garand had saved his life more times than he could count. Not because of any single extraordinary shot, but because of its reliability. Never jammed, never failed, always fired when he pulled the trigger. There was Sergeant Curtis Cullen, who invented the Rhino hedge-cutting device for Sherman tanks in Normandy, and who credited his survival to his Garand during the weeks his units spent fighting through the Bocage country, where every field and lane could hide German soldiers with Panzerfausts perhaps. The most telling testimony came not from Americans, but from their enemies. In the months after Germany's surrender, as American forces occupied the defeated nation, soldiers and journalists conducted thousands of informal interviews with Wehrmacht veterans. One question frequently asked was what weapon they feared most. The answers varied. Many cited American artillery, others the P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bomber, still others the Sherman tank when employed in numbers. But among infantry soldiers, the M1 Garand featured prominently, not because it was more lethal than a machine gun or more devastating than artillery, but because it was everywhere, in the hands of every American soldier they faced, delivering more fire than they had expected, more fire than their doctrine had prepared them for. A former Wehrmacht officer named Paul Dietrich, interviewed in 1946, put it succinctly: "We were trained to fear the American machine gun, the Browning. We were taught to identify its sound, to take cover when we heard it, to call for our own MG-42 to suppress it. This made sense. Machine gun against machine gun, our MG-42 had the higher rate of fire. But what we were not prepared for was that every American had what sounded like a machine gun. Not the same rate of fire, of course, but constant. In Russia, when you charged a Soviet position and they had only rifles, you knew there would be gaps in their fire. You timed your movement between their shots. With Americans, there were no gaps. Someone was always shooting. You could not time your movement because there was no rhythm, only constant fire. This changes everything about infantry combat. It changed everything, but not immediately and not obviously. Wars are not won by rifles alone, and the Garand was just one factor among thousands that determined the war's outcome. American industrial capacity, air superiority, naval power. The two-front war that stretched Axis resources to breaking point, the resilience of the Soviet Union. The entry of the United States into the war, at all these were the strategic factors that mattered most. But at the tactical level, in the moment-to-moment experience of combat, the Garand gave American soldiers an edge. It allowed them to deliver more fire per soldier than their enemies. And in infantry combat, volume of fire translates to suppression, and suppression translates to survival. The symbolic weight of that 8-round clip came to represent something larger than its tactical function. It represented American abundance in the face of Axis scarcity. German soldiers, by 1944, were often fighting with ammunition rationed to as few as 20 rounds per day. Japanese soldiers in bypassed garrisons were sometimes reduced to 5 rounds per weapon, conserving every bullet for the final, inevitable American assault. Meanwhile, American soldiers carried their 80 to 200 rounds as standard, with battalion ammunition dumps holding millions more rounds in reserve. The en-bloc clip was cheaper, a few cents worth of stamped steel, but it symbolized a nation that could afford to give each soldier not just enough ammunition, but more than enough. It symbolized a military philosophy that valued firepower over fire discipline, that trusted its soldiers to shoot when necessary rather than hoarding scarce resources. This abundance was ideological as much as material. The United States, alone among major combatants, increased its civilian standard of living during the war years, while British, German, Soviet, and Japanese civilians endured rationing, bombing, and deprivation. Americans experienced near full employment, rising wages, and shortages that were, by global standards, mild inconveniences. This prosperity was not was the result of an industrial economy so vast that it could simultaneously produce unlimited war material and maintain civilian consumption. The Garand, with its demand for billions of rounds of ammunition and millions of en-bloc clips, could only exist because the American economy could sustain such profligacy. Axis soldiers, scrounging for ammunition and equipment, understood this. They understood that the American they fought was backed by a nation that could afford to waste ammunition, to fire 8 rounds and discard the clip, to reload and fire 8 more, without ever worrying if there would be ammunition tomorrow. By the time victory came, in the spring and summer of 1945, over 500,000 American soldiers had carried Garands into combat across Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. The rifle had fired billions of rounds, had been dropped in mud and sand and jungle rivers, had been frozen in Belgian winters and cooked under Pacific sun, and it had kept firing. Its reliability became legendary, the rifle that always worked, even when nothing else did. Soldiers returning home brought their Garands back when regulations allowed, or bought them as surplus in later years, keeping them as memorials to their service. The distinctive ping of the ejecting clip became a sound of memory, a ghost echo of battles won and friends lost. In the decades after the war, military analysts and historians would debate the Garand's true impact. Some argued that its advantage had been overstated, that the outcome of World War II had been determined by factors far larger than the rate of fire of infantry rifles. Others maintained that, in the aggregate, across millions of small engagements, the Garand had saved thousands of American lives and shortened the war by months if not years. The truth, as always, lies somewhere between these poles. The Garand did not win the war alone, but it gave individual soldiers a better chance of survival. And in a war that consumed more than 400,000 American lives, every advantage mattered. What is certain is that the Garand changed how the world thought about infantry rifles. After World War II, every major military moved toward semi-automatic or automatic rifles as standard infantry weapons. The age of the bolt-action rifle, which had dominated from 1890 to 1945, ended decisively. The future belonged to weapons that could fire as fast as their operators could pull the trigger, that could sustain fire without manual cycling, that distributed lethality across the entire infantry squad rather than concentrating it in specialist weapons. The Garand had proved the concept. Every military rifle developed since 1945, the Soviet AK-47, the Belgian FN-FOL, the German G3, the American M14 and M16 descended from the lessons the Garand taught. The small metal rectangle of the en-bloc clip, that simple mechanism of 8 cartridges held in a stamped steel frame, had echoed across the battlefields of a global war. It had announced American presence with its distinctive ping. It had enabled American infantry to deliver fire at rates their enemies could not match. It had symbolized American industrial might and democratic values, the belief that even a common soldier, a farmer from Iowa or a clerk from Brooklyn, deserved a rifle that gave him every possible advantage. In the terrible algebra of war, where survival often depends on microseconds and millimeters, the Garand's en-bloc clip system had shifted the equation in favor of the American soldier, and so, in the end, the story of the Garand is not really about a rifle at all. It is about a choice to value the life of each soldier enough to equip him with the best possible weapon, a choice to organize an entire industrial economy around supporting those soldiers in combat, a choice to believe that technological superiority could substitute for years of military tradition and professional warrior culture. The armies of Germany and Japan were, in many ways, superior fighting forces at the war's beginning. Their soldiers were better trained, more experienced, more indoctrinated in military values. But they carried bolt-action rifles, because their nation's industrial capacity and military philosophy could not sustain anything more. The American soldiers who faced them were often green recruits, hastily trained and ideologically ambivalent about the war. But they carried Garands because their nation could afford to give them Garands, and because their nation believed that firepower could overcome inexperience in the cold calculus of war. That belief proved correct. The Garand did not make American soldiers invincible, but it made them more lethal, and in a war of attrition. Lethality compounds across millions of engagements into eventual victory. The 8-round clip, that small innovation in ammunition feeding, had amplified the combat effectiveness of an entire army. That metallic ping, echoing across fields and jungles and city streets, announced not just an empty rifle, but the exhaustion of Axis hopes. Behind that American soldier with his empty Garand stood 10 more soldiers with full rifles, and behind them stood trucks filled with millions of clips, and behind those trucks stood factories producing billions of rounds, and behind those factories stood an economy that could outproduce the rest of the world combined. Klaus Becker, the young Wehrmacht officer who had watched the Bataan fighting in January 1942, did not survive the war. He died in early 1945 in a prisoner of war camp in the Philippines, victim of tropical disease and the same harsh conditions that killed thousands of Allied prisoners in Japanese captivity. But his observations, preserved in that intercepted letter, captured something essential about the American way of war. The Americans did not fire as others did. They fired faster, more continuously, with less thought for ammunition, conservation, and more trust in their supply lines. They fired with the confidence of soldiers who knew that more ammunition was always coming. that their nation's factories would never fail them, that the clip that ejected with that distinctive ping could be immediately replaced with another. This was the sound of democracy at war, not elegant, not efficient in the traditional military sense, but effective through sheer, overwhelming abundance, and in that effectiveness lay a truth larger than any single battle or campaign. A free society, mobilized for war, could match and exceed the military effectiveness of totalitarian states, not by becoming like them, but by remaining true to its own values, by valuing the life of each citizen soldier, by harnessing industrial capacity to multiply individual effectiveness, by distributing power, even the power of rapid fire, across all soldiers rather than concentrating it in an elite few. The M1 Garand, with its democratic distribution of lethality and its demand for industrial abundance, was the perfect weapon for such a society. It was a rifle that could only have been produced by America and could only have been wielded by Americans. And in the echo of its 8-round clip lay the sound of freedom reloading, ready to fire again.